Hello everyone, welcome back to Law on Obligations and Contracts. For this video, we will continue discussing about extinguishment of obligations. If you can recall, we have already discussed the first and the second modes of extinguishing an obligation, which are the payment or performance and the loss of the thing due. Now let us continue discussing the next mode of extinguishing an obligation, which is condonation or remission of debt. First, what is condonation or remission? Under the law, condonation or remission is a gratuitous abandonment by the creditor of his right against the debtor. It is a form of donation. So when you say condonation or remission, it means that the creditor does not anymore require or demand the performance of the obligation by the debtor. It is a form of donation because the abandonment is gratuitous. It means that there is no consideration or there is no payment in exchange of the abandonment of the obligation. In short, it is free. So what are the requisites of condonation or remission? When you say requisites, it means that these are the things or the elements that should be complied with before you can say that there is a valid condonation or remission of the debt so as to extinguish the obligation. So, what are the requisites? First, it must be gratuitous. It means that the condonation or remission of the debt must be free. There must be no consideration or walang kapalit. Second, it must be accepted by the obligor. Otherwise, the condonation or remission will not be valid. Third, the parties must have capacity because accordingly, a person who cannot make donation out of something that he does not own. Fourth, it must not be in officious. Later, we will discuss about the element of in officious or the fourth element. And lastly, if made expressly, it must comply with the forms of donation. So under the law, there are also requisites for a valid donation. So if the condonation or remission is done expressly, that donation or remission should conform with the requisites for a valid donation. Now let's go to kinds of remission. First, as to its extent, a condonation or remission may be complete when it covers the entire obligation. For example, D obliges himself to deliver 10,000 pesos to C. If C, for example, will condone the 10,000 pesos, which means that he will no longer collect the 10,000 pesos from D, then the condonation or remission is complete because it covers the entire 10,000 pesos. A condonation or remission may be partial when it does not cover the entire obligation. For example, in the same scenario, D obliges himself to deliver 10,000 pesos to C. What if C later on will condone 5,000 pesos of the obligation? Meaning to say, D will only have to pay the remaining 5,000 pesos to C because the 5,000 pesos was already condoned by C, partially. Second kind of remission as to its form is express. A condonation or remission is express when it is made either verbally or in writing. Meaning to say, the creditor, by words or verbally, said to the debtor that he will no longer collect the obligation, or he will no longer demand the performance of the obligation. Or it may be done in writing, meaning to say the creditor gave the debtor a written condonation or remission of the debt. Impliedly presumed, or it could be presumed from the circumstances that the creditor had already condoned or remitted the obligation through his conduct of not collecting the obligation despite its deadline or despite the lapse of time. Third, as to its date of effectivity. A condonation or remission may be effective inter vivos when it will take effect during the lifetime of the donor. For example, D obliges himself to deliver 10,000 pesos to C. While C is still alive, he told D that he will no longer collect the 10,000 pesos. So, the date of effectivity of the remission or condonation is inter vivos because it was made effective during the lifetime of the donor or the creditor, as this would be. Or a condonation or remission may take effect mortis causa when it will become effective upon the death of the donor. And therefore, it must comply with the formalities of a will. So let us go to the next slide. Effect of inofficious remission. We said that if you have a property worth 1 million pesos, you cannot give more than that which you have. So you cannot give another property than that you own, or than the property that is registered to you. So kung siya pa na siya, dili ka pwede muhatag sa uban more than sa imo kaya nga ihatag. So this actually refers to the capacity of the person to alienate a thing or to make donations. So let us say, for example, my only property is, for example, a car. So I cannot give you another car which I do not own because that is beyond my capacity to give. Or if I have a 1 million peso in my bank and that's the only money I have, I cannot give away 2 million pesos because that is more than my capacity to give. So that is what we mean by you cannot give more than that which you can give by will. So what will the effect if you have given something in excess of your capacity to give? Under the law, the excess shall be in officious and shall be reduced by the court accordingly. So the best example of this is about inheritance. So under the law, if a person dies and he left properties after his death, there's what we call legitime. And what is this legitime? This is part of the testator's property or the deceased property which he cannot dispose of because the law has reserved it for certain heirs who are therefore called compulsory heirs. So, meaning to say, if a person dies, his property is subject to the rule on legitime, which means that a portion of that property cannot be disposed of by the deceased during his lifetime, or or after his death, by will, kapag meron siyang last will and testament, because a portion of that is reserved to his or her compulsory heirs. Sino yung mga compulsory heirs? Sila yung mga anak, asawa, kung wala siyang anak, yung kanyang parents, kung buhay pa, asawa, or kung wala siyang asawa, single siya, wala din siyang parents, then to his brothers and sisters. So, meaning to say, when you say inofficious remission, I will give you an example. For example, D has an obligation to deliver 500,000 pesos to C. Now, C, for example, let us say, died. Namatay si C. Karon, he has compulsory heirs. May anak siya, may asawa siya, etc. Let us say, for example, si C, before siya namatay, may ginawa siyang last will and testament. Sa last will and testament na yan, nakalagay doon, sabi ni C doon sa last will and testament niya na he will condone the entire 500,000 obligation of D. Let us presume na yan lang yung only property na naiwan ni C, yung 500,000 pesos na credit niya from D. Sabi ni C, huwag mo nang bayaran lahat ng yan na nakalagay sa last will and testament. Now question, valid ba yung condonation or remission? The answer is no. Because according to Article 1270 of the Civil Code, in order for a condonation or remission of the debt to be valid, it must not be inofficious. Kailan ba nagiging inofficious yung remission or condonation? Sabi ng batas, kapag sobra siya sa capacity mo to give or to alienate. Or sobra siya sa capacity mo to donate. Now, in this case, sabi ko diba kanina, na kapag ang person namatay, may property siya na naiwan, yung property niya is subject sa legitim. Meaning to say, a portion of that belongs to the compulsory heirs. So you cannot dispose of yung share, yung portion na na-reserve sa compulsory heirs that is beyond the capacity of the deceased person. Now, in the given example, I said that C condoned the entire 500,000 pesos, which is the only property left for his compulsory heirs. Yung entire 500,000 ang kinondone ni C. And take note, a portion of that 500,000 belongs or is reserved to the compulsory heirs. Let's say half of that is reserved to the compulsory heirs. So meaning to say, hindi valid yung condonation or remission kasi subject siya sa legitim. Yung condonation or remission naging inofficious kasi nga, sabi ng batas, you cannot give more than that which you can give by will. Dahil yung kaya niya lang ibigay by will or i-dispose of by way of donation is yung half lang ng 500,000. Therefore, the condonation of the entire 500,000 pesos is inofficious. Sobra-sobra siya sa kakayahan ni deceased person or ni creditor na i-donate. So, inofficious siya. So, anong mangyayari ngayon? Dahil sobra, di ba sabi ko na ang last will and testament PC, kinundon niya yung entire 500,000. Which is, under the law, half of it lang ang dapat niyang i-donate kasi nga, yung half of it is reserved to the compulsory heirs. So, ano ang mangyayari ngayon? Anong epekto ngayon kung ganun ang pagkondon yung entire 500,000? Sabi ng batas, it shall be reduced by the court accordingly. So, pwede siyang i-reduce ng korte. So, since half of the 500,000 is reserved to the compulsory heirs, then yung valid lang na remission is up to 250,000. Meaning to say, D has to pay the remaining 250,000 to the compulsory heirs. So let's proceed to presumptions. Under Article 1271, the delivery of a private document evidencing a credit made voluntarily by the creditor to the debtor implies the renunciation of the action which the former had against the latter. An implied or tacit remission. So I will give you an example. So meron silang private document. Of course, itong private document, hawak-hawak ito ni creditor. Kasi yan yung proof of credit. Yan ang gagamitin ni creditor para maningil kay debtor. Now, what if, for example, the creditor voluntarily delivered the promissory note to the debtor? Okay? Under the law, kapag yun ang nangyari, dineliver ni creditor voluntarily, meaning kusang loob niya na dineliver kay debtor yung promissory note, yung ebidensya ng credit. Sabi ng batas, kapag yan ang nangyari, there is an implication that there is a renunciation of the action which the former had against the latter. Meron daw presumption na na-renounce na yung action ni creditor against the debtor. Presumption lang. Meaning to say, subject siya to rebuttal evidence. For example, sabihin hindi talaga ni-renounce ni creditor yung action. Pero kapag walang evidence to rebut that presumption, then the presumption will still apply. Second paragraph. If in order to nullify this waiver, it should be claimed to be inofficious, the debtor and his heirs may uphold it by proving that the delivery of the document was made in virtue of payment of the debt. So this second paragraph of Article 1271, the renunciation of the action which the creditor had against the debtor may be nullified or invalidated by a showing that the waiver is inofficious. So you go back to the previous slide about inofficious remission. So if it is proved that the waiver is inofficious, then the creditor may nullify or invalidate the waiver. However, in order to contradict the claim that the waiver is inofficious, the debtor and his heirs may prove that the delivery of the document was really made in virtue of payment of the debt and not of remission. So pwedeng sabihin ni debtor na, binayaran ko kasi yung utang, kaya niya deliver sa akin yung promissory note. That the creditor delivered it voluntarily unless the contrary is proved. For example, D owes C 1,000 pesos evidenced by a promissory note. The note signed by D is given to C. If the promissory note is voluntarily delivered to D, the presumption is that the debt must have been paid by D. If it is known that D has not yet paid C, it must be presumed that the obligation has been remitted by C. So So, sa given example, di ba sabi natin na yung 1,000 pesos, meron siyang ebidensya, yung promissory note. The normal course of business transaction is that yung promissory note, dapat hawak yan ng creditor. Kasi yan yung ebidensya niya na merong utang si D sa kanya. So, kapag yung promissory note na yan, voluntarily delivered to D, binigay voluntarily ni C kay D, may presumption na bayad na yung utang. The presumption is that C had condoned or remitted the 1,000 pesos obligation. Kasi alam niya na hindi pa nakabayad si D, and yet he voluntarily delivered the promissory note to D. So there is a presumption na hindi na siya magko-collect kay D. So meron ng condonation relation. Suppose it is not known how D came into possession of the promissory note, the presumption is that it was voluntarily delivered by C, unless C proves the contrary. So, meaning to say, kapag hindi alam ni D kung bakit nasa kanya yung promissory note, ang presumption doon is that it was voluntarily delivered. Unless na lang, merong ibigay na proof si C na hindi talaga yon voluntarily delivered. Okay? So that is Article 1272. Next presumption is found under Article 1274. It is presumed that the accessory obligation of pledge has been remitted when the thing pledged after its delivery to the creditor is found in the possession of the debtor or of a third person who owns the thing. So first, let us define pledge. Pledge is a contract by virtue of which the debtor delivers to the creditor or to a third person a movable or instrument evidencing incorporeal rights for the purpose of securing the fulfillment of a principal obligation with the understanding that when the obligation is fulfilled, the thing delivered shall be returned with all its fruits and accessories. So, sa madaling salita, ang pledge ay isang property or instrument that secures the fulfillment of an obligation. Pananglitan, ako, nangutang ko sa inyo. Para ma-make sure na ako na mabayaran ang utang, maghatag ko collateral. Pero say, sing-sing, pledge, i-pledge na ako. Kung sa Bisaya pa, when you say pledge, prinda, iprinda nimo imong sing-sing. Para ma-secure ang fulfillment or payment of the obligation. So, a contract of pledge under the law is an accessory obligation. What does that mean? When you say accessory obligation, it is an obligation that is dependent upon another obligation. Meaning to say, there is a principal obligation to which that accessory obligation attaches. So, if there is no principal obligation, then there will be no accessory obligation. So, ganito. In the given example, okay, ako may utang sa inyo. Let's say 10,000 pesos. Para ma-secure ko yung utang na yan, nag-pledge ako ng sing-sing. In the event na hindi ako makabayad sa aking utang, yung sing-sing ang aking pangbayad. Yan yung pledge. So, saan doon ngayon ang principal, saan ang accessory? Ang principal obligation, yung utang ko sa'yo na 10,000 pesos. Yung accessory obligation, yung pledge, yung sing-sing. Okay? So, meaning to say, kapag wala yung utang, kapag nabayaran ko yung utang, ibig sabihin, mawawala din yung obligation ko under pledge. Kasi, Yung principal obligation, bayad na. Okay? So, meaning to say, yung accessory obligation of pledge, nag-i-exist lang yan kung merong principal obligation. So, ngayon, pag-usapan natin ang Article 1274. Under Article 1274, ulitin natin, it is presumed that the accessory obligation of pledge has been remitted when the thing pledged after its delivery to the creditor is found in the possession of the debtor or of a third person who owns the thing. For example, D delivers to C his diamond ring in pledge to guarantee the payment of loan. Ano dito yung principal obligation? Yung loan. Para magarantya yung pagbayad ng loan, nagbigay siya ng diamond ring as pledge. Now, what if, for example, yung ring later is found in the possession of D? So, di ba, kung nakatry na mo mag-pledge, kung nakatry na mo magprenda, kung inyuhang alahas, di ba ang alahas, imo man yun nang ihatag dito sa imong giprendahan, bago ni mo makuha tong kwarta, karon. Dili nila iuli ang imong giprenda nga alahas hangtod sa dili mo mabayaran ng utang, tama? So meaning to say, what if for example, giuli nila sa imuha ang imong giprenda nga alahas? Meaning to say, that jewelry is now in your possession. So unsay presumption sa balaod? The presumption is that the creditor na tanggalin na yung obligation under pledge. Wala nang guarantee. Yung loan na lang yung maiiwan. So that is the presumption. The effect of renunciation of principal debt. We discussed earlier about principal obligation and accessory obligation. Diba? Sabi natin, in a contract of loan with a guarantee or a pledge, for example, yung loan ang principal, yung pledge yung accessory. Meaning to say, yung accessory, hindi yun nag-i-exist kung wala itong principal obligation. Kasi di ba yung purpose ng accessory is to secure the payment of the principal obligation. So kung walang principal, hindi walang accessory. Paano ngayon kung yung principal obligation mismo ni-renounce, meaning to say, merong condonation or remission of the principal obligation. So what is the rule? The rule is provided under Article 1273 of the Civil Code, which provides that the renunciation of the principal debt shall extinguish the accessory obligations, but the waiver of the latter shall leave the former in force. So take note of the principle or the rule that the accessory follows the principal. While the accessory obligation cannot exist without the principal obligation, the latter may exist without the former. So ito yung sinasabi ko kanina na ang accessory obligation, nag-i-exist lang yan kung may principal obligation. Kung walang principal obligation, walang accessory. Yun ang rule. So kapag yan ang rule, ibig sabihin, kapag kinundon ni creditor, yung principal obligation, it follows na yung accessory obligation, nakondone na din yun. Pero kung yung accessory obligation na nakondone under Article 1274, hindi ibig sabihin na yung principal obligation nakondone siya ni creditor. Kasi, under Article 1237, sabi dyan, ang pag-renounce daw ng principal obligation will extinguish, mawawala yung accessory obligation. Pero, kapag nawala daw yung accessory obligation, yung principal obligation will remain in force, meaning valid, effective, hindi nawala. Okay? So for example, D owes C 1,000 pesos with G as guarantor. So, in the given example, the principal obligation here is the loan amounting to 1,000 pesos. And G here, the guarantor, is the accessory obligation. Ano yung obligation ngayon ni guarantor? Kapag hindi daw nakabayad si D, si guarantor ang magbabayad. So, yun yung accessory. Okay? C, condoned the obligation of D of 1,000 pesos. Meaning to say, sabi ni C, D, wag mo nila akong bayaran sa 1,000 pesos. Ano ang mangyayari ngayon sa obligation ni guarantor? Ayan, balikan natin yung 1273. Di ba sabi natin, under Article 1273, kapag daw na-renounce yung principal obligation, ang effect niyan is that na-extinguish din yung accessory obligation. It's as if na-renounce din yung accessory obligation. So, ang effect is that yung obligation ngayon ni guarantor na bayaran si creditor in the event na hindi makabayad si debtor will now be extinguished. Kasi the creditor, C, had already condoned the obligation of D, the principal obligation of D, which is 1,000 pesos. But what if, for example, let us change the facts. The creditor condoned the obligation of the guarantor. Sabi ni creditor, hindi ko na kailangan ng guarantor. Guarantor, I will release you from the obligation to pay me in the event that the debtor will not be able to pay 1,000 pesos. So, ano ang mangyayari ngayon sa principal obligation? Balikan natin yung 1273. Sabi ng 1273, kapag daw yung accessory obligation na waive or na-renounce ni creditor, it will leave the principal obligation in force. Nakasaad dyan na kahit na yung guarantor ni-release ni creditor, ang principal obligation hindi will remain in force, will continue. Andun pa rin, hindi nawala. Kasi nga, accessory follows the principal, but the principal will not follow the accessory obligation. So, that ends our discussion for condonation or remission of debt. See you in our next video.